the fact that I discovered a group of people who were very similar in their kinship systems to the Naya. And that whole matrilineal, matrilateral kinship system, which at that time existed in eastern Ceylon, got Edmund Leach extremely excited. So we had great fun.
Another person, in case I forget to mention them, because the copy of Under the Boat Tree that I've got with me here is a copy you gave to my former PhD supervisor, Christoph von Führer-Heimendorf.
Oh yes.
And so you must have at least met him, did you?
Oh yes, I met him a number of times, and since I speak quite fluent German, we used to speak German together. And he had taken a liking to me, and he was interested, of course, in India and Indian materials. He'd worked in South India, and so the work I was doing was fun for him. And yes, we met from time to time. I used to go down to London to give seminars, and yes.
Yes. You met Betty, did you?
Yes.
His wife.
Yes.
What was your impression of Christoph? And some people say that he is a very great ethnographer, but not so much an analytical theorist, etc. He was a very good administrator, built up the science department.
Yes.
But more as a person, what was your impression?
I didn't really know him terribly well. It was he had spent a lot of time in India, and so the Indian materials were very much on his mind. He didn't know too much about Africa, and so theoretically he was always he was considered rather lightweight by the others, by people like Firth and Leach and others. Didn't take him too seriously, but obviously he was a very considerable ethnographer, and wrote all those good books on his work in South India. But I didn't know him terribly well.
Returning to your PhD fieldwork, I often ask whether the person I'm talking to remembers the first moment or the first days or weeks of their arrival in the strange land, that kind of Malinowski moment of landing on the beach and wondering what they're going to make of all this. Do you remember that?
I remember it vividly, yes indeed. I landed in Colombo. I had been in Istanbul, where the summer had been beautiful, and I landed in Colombo and was walking up and down the seashore, and I saw these huge crabs, really large ones, fighting each other. And I thought, well, we're in for an interesting sort of adventure here. Edmund had made arrangements with a lady called Mrs. Fernando, who was a socialite, a very intelligent person in Colombo, and she was a friend of his. And I went to see her. Edmund, by that time, had already gone off into his village. And I wanted to go and see Edmund, to talk to him as to how to proceed. And Mrs. Fernando and I quickly made arrangements for me to buy a second-hand Volkswagen. And I did that. And she arranged also a Tamil cook for me, so that I would have someone to cook for me when I went into my village. And I took this Volkswagen, one of the old types in which you had to double declutch the clutch, a very unusual kind of mechanical contraption. And I drove up to Edmund's Pulelia village. I had no idea what to expect, and it was really utterly fascinating to drive through this beautiful countryside with the peasantry all around, people working in their fields and so on. This was September, October, and the rains had come, and it was raining very hard, and I had to veer off from the main road, find my way. There were good maps, so that was not a problem, but I found my way to Pulelia, and as I drove into the village, there was Edmund wearing a very dirty pair of shorts and a dirty t-shirt and waving, gesticulating to me. So I stopped, and he had literally whitewashed the inside of a cowshed. And he had moved into this cowshed, since there was no other building that was available in this village. And he was totally surrounded by a group of little brown children who were, getting into everything. And he had a cook and a sort of lean-to where the cooking was prepared. And so we sat at camp chairs and had an extremely animated conversation on, the work he was doing and the excitement of this village and the structure of the village and the organization of the lands and so on. He was full of enthusiasm. I remember this vividly. Then later in the afternoon, the rain stopped, and it was muggy and hot, and all the villagers used to go to the village tank. The villages had these tanks where water was collected for the irrigation of the rice fields, and we went to this village tank, sort of rather like a sizable lake, and the villagers were just standing on the shores and bathing, not going very deep. The water was the color of coffee, dark brown, brownish. Certainly you couldn't see through it. And I, having just come from the Mediterranean, I thought I would take a swim. So I plunged in and swam to the middle of this lake and lay on my back and then swam out. And as I came out, Edmund said, he said, the villagers tell me that there is a crocodile in here, but I don't believe it. And we joked about that and so on. The next morning, they did in fact catch a huge crocodile, which had been lurking in those murky waters. So that was the beginning of my time in
you say in your book that
Ceylon.
you were very impressed by Edmund's energy and
yes.
Fieldwork methods.
I could not have entered into fieldwork without his example. That example of being right in the middle of everything in the village, together with the rest of the people around, this easy relationship with them was a very vivid example for me. So I immediately found myself a village much larger than his, much more complicated, but I did the same thing. I having seen the example that it worked, so I went in and got a little hut and established myself and started talking to the people and improving my language and so on. It was I found an extremely beautiful village, Teripehe, in Walapane, near Nildandahinna. Was a lovely place in the middle of the mountains, and it was very far away, because we thought at that time that it would be easier to analyze more traditional communities if they are relatively isolated. I think that probably was a mistake, actually, but in any case, at that time, that's what we thought. So I found this very isolated place, very far away, and I had to walk for 2 or 3 hours after leaving the car on the main road over the mountains to get into the village. And this had been a village that had been there for a very long time, used as a place of banishment for people during the Kandyan kingdom, for criminals. But I found it a wonderful place, extremely beautiful, with a lovely climate, and I made many friends there.
It used to have malaria, but by the time
Yes.
you got there it didn't. Is that right?
Yes, there wasn't, malaria was more or less under control. Yes, of course there had been, malaria was a serious problem. We all took, I think it was Paludrin at that time, very carefully. I was very lucky. I never got ill at all. Of course I was very young, that helps. But it was a very productive and exciting period. But looking back upon the fieldwork, again I'm struck by our naivete. That is to say, we did not see the great, the great turmoil, the great hurricane that was going to hit the island with the political problems of the Tamils and the Sinhalese. We really had no idea that this was coming. We were still enjoying the afterglow of the colonial period, in which the colonial administration had kept these tensions under control, and they were there, but they had not come out in their full nastiness as they did later. So from the time we left the island in 1958, 56, 57, things began, the political process began to become more and more ominous. The clouds got darker and darker, and things, relations between people got worse and worse. And so some of the villages where I had been working in eastern Ceylon, where there had been complete merging of the Tamils and the Sinhalese, they had mixed and intermarried for generations, had multiple names, Sinhalese names as well as Tamil names in the family and so on. All those were severely tested as a result of the Tamil-Sinhalese troubles, which have still not subsided, of course. And we really had no sense of this problem coming.
Do you think you didn't have a sense because it was the people themselves didn't have a sense of it? In other words, it wasn't very pronounced, but political events then generated it, as it did in much of Macedonia and Bosnia and so on. Many anthropologists went there and didn't see what was happening.
Yes.
Or do you have a view, a sort of more Freudian view, that it was there all the time but just repressed, and it was partly your naivety that made it impossible for you to see it?
I think the latter, actually. I think we were naive. We were naive because it was also because the experience, the colonial experience, had been so thoroughgoing, and things had been so well managed. I mean, when I think of the fact that I remember reading somewhere that the whole of Bengal was administered by 2 or 3 Britishers for a very long time. The total number of police in Ceylon when we were there, the total number was something like 15,000 for a population of, what was it at that time, maybe 10, 12 million. That's absolutely minimal numbers. So obviously things were quiet in terms of political problems and administration, but soon, with elections, with popular representations, with popular leaders whipping up the crowds, things began to move in very ominous directions and have not really ceased being extremely worrying.
Just to finish on your PhD, which presumably was what turned into Under the Bow Tree.
Yes.
Can you summarise the main theme? It seems that a Levi-Straussian attempt to see structural transformations
Yes.
of kinship systems, but
Yes.
you can summarise it better than I can, I'm sure.
Well, I was so we were very concerned about the whole question of structures and the structure of consciousness, and I think this is still a very important problem. Lévi-Strauss has written about this in very imaginative ways. I think it goes back to the whole question raised by Durkheim of the conscience collective. What is it that makes a conscience collective? Sartre, when he was criticizing Durkheim and Lévi-Strauss, said conscience collective, that's a sort of weird, what are these weird, gooey realities outside the individual? The only thing I can recognize, he wrote, is individual consciousness. I am aware of what I am aware of, and these things outside the individual consciousness, collective consciousness, that's just nonsense. Yet we know full well that there is such a thing as collective consciousness, and the problem is how to understand it and how to analyze it and investigate it. And Lévi-Strauss has taken one direction in trying to analyze it by going further and further in the analysis of these mythologies. In any case, we thought that, Edmund Leach and I thought that by investigating the organization and structure of kinship systems, we would be able to understand something about how the mentality and consciousness of the society, as far as kinship systems is concerned, works, and whether there is something orderly in this organization. So that was the first step. And I was very fortunate to find a whole range of variations of kinship systems in Ceylon, which seemed to me parallel to a whole range of variations of kinship systems in South India. I came to this conclusion only after I came back and I finished my PhD. I started working on my PhD to see if I could turn it into something that made sense as a book. And the more I worked on it, the more this matter of patterns of consciousness, which are then manipulated, whereby you can have structures which change into other structures, that whole problem, the intellectual aspect of that problem became very exciting for me. And I found all of a sudden that these patterns that I had seen from west to east in Sri Lanka, and then from west to east in South India, could be put together in a kind of construct of combinations and permutations. And so intellectually, I think that still makes sense, that there is something there, because because our minds are organized to be able to manage complicated things like mathematics. It is clear that societies too manage their relations, particularly if they are traditional and old societies, can have these arrangements in which they have a pattern, and then in order to express difference, the next group changes the pattern slightly. So the whole game of differentiation, difference, turns out to be this manipulation of patterns. And that is really what I found very exciting and interesting, and I wanted to write about. What I have not written enough about is the irrational aspects of this. And I think there is an irrational. Obviously, human consciousness is not entirely rational. There are rational areas and there are irrational areas. And I will go back to the question of irrationality, which I think turns around all these elaborate systems associated with sacrifice and rituals and other matters of that kind.
So when you went first to Chicago in...
Well, before we get there, let me say something about Peterhouse.
Yes.
After coming back from Ceylon and having more or less finished the thesis, I was made Byfellow of Peterhouse, which was a very happy occasion for me, very exciting. And at that time I had some close friends who were Peter Pauling and Linda Pauling.
This is the famous Pauling family.
This is the famous Pauling family. They had, and Linus Pauling had gotten one Nobel Prize, and then he'd got another Nobel Prize, and Crick and Watson were working. I was living in the house of Kendrew,
Yes.
John Kendrew, who was a fellow of Peterhouse, and it was a very happy time for me to be a fellow of Peterhouse. And I was about 28, 29, and I had not done my military service in Turkey. And my family was getting rather antsy about this, because unless you do your military service, you can't, you might lose your citizenship and so on, and I wasn't prepared to do that. So I went back to Turkey. I had to give up my fellowship at Peterhouse. Everyone was very surprised. With all the nice wines and the nice rooms and so on, one doesn't give that sort of up very easily. But I did that, and I spent almost 2 years in the Turkish military, which was fascinating for me. After my fieldwork in Ceylon, this was another bout of fieldwork, essentially, in Turkey with the Kurds, with Arabs, with all sorts of other Turkish groups from the north, with Georgians and so on, all of whom in very intimate surroundings in the military. Quite fascinating. And since by that time, I was referred to as a docent, I had very high status, high prestige. And so the military life was rather easy. And it was just about the time when there was a military coup d'etat in Turkey against the elected government of Adnan Menderes. And to watch all of that from very close quarters in the general headquarters in Ankara, where the officers around me were all getting very excited about this event, which had very profound implications for the entire country, was an experience that I found very important. I was also fortunate because the president then, the military person who became the president, General Gürsel, had heard about me. So he invited me to go to the presidential palace and asked me to set up a planning board for the country. Imagine being given a task like that at the age of 30, very heady stuff. So I got together some of my friends from the universities there, and we set up the legal arrangements for this board and got it passed through the provisional parliament and so on. But I decided that if I stayed in that line, I was obviously going to be drawn further and further into politics. And I really didn't like the idea of military politics. I didn't like the kind of implications that this had. And so I said to my friends in the planning board, I'm not going to go on with this. I'm going to go back to academic life. And Edmund at that time was going to California, to the Center for Behavioral Studies in California. So he arranged the center to extend an invitation to me as well. So I got this invitation. This was 1960, fall 1960, from California, where Roman Jakobson was going to be present as well. So the attractions of having Edmund, Roman Jakobson, in California in this beautiful climate, and I was having troubles with my first wife, my Turkish wife, who the marriage was not going too well. I thought this was just the right time to make a break. And so I said to her, come with me, if you like, to America. She said, no, I will stay here. So I went to California and liked it. I thought California was a wonderful, beautiful place, and so open and so, in its own way, in the 1960s, still so naive and innocent as far as the ways of the old world is concerned, and a tremendous sense of optimism towards the future. And so Edmund and Roman Jakobson and I had a really quite wonderful time at the center, talking about our theories, about symbolism, about language, the significance of language, the symbolic aspects of language, and that was a very lively period for me. And then the American universities started getting interested in my staying there, and I got an offer from Chicago, which was to the effect that I could have 6 months teaching and 6 months free. And I thought this was very nice, so I accepted that and joined the University of Chicago after the period in Stanford. Edmund wanted me to come back to Cambridge, and he was, I think, somewhat unhappy that I stayed in Chicago. He wanted us to continue to work together here. But I found that at the time there was a great deal of interest in America, in Turkey as well. So the combination of the interests in the universities in the Middle East, and I had just been involved in this heady adventure in Turkey, and made it so that I could see there were many other aspects in American academic life which would be interesting to me. So with a sense of considerable regret, I decided that I would stay there rather than return to Cambridge.
Are you mainly known in America as a Turkish expert or a Sri Lankan expert?
Well, I think they probably don't know quite where to put me, because I have really very profound interests in India and Sri Lanka. And since then, I have also developed further interests in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, Thailand, and of course Japan. But I was the director of the Middle East Center at Chicago for 4 years, where I put together quite an interesting team of people. One of them was this man that Jack was mentioning yesterday, Halil İnalcık, the historian of the Ottoman Empire. Another one was Professor Fahir is a professor of the history of literature, Ottoman literature. A third one was Alexander Bennigsen, a specialist on Central Asia, the Turks of Central Asia. So I was able to put together quite an interesting group there. And working there, I also traveled quite a bit in the various Middle Eastern countries. I had already had very close contacts with Iran. The father of my first wife had offices in Tehran, Baghdad, Beirut, and Cairo. also mistresses in all these cities. But so I had visited him in Tehran. He was a very lively and wonderful man. And so I knew quite a bit about the Middle East. And so being the director of the Middle East Center was an interesting experience. So yes, you're right. There is that aspect of me was the one that the Americans were more interested in, because at that time there wasn't a great deal of interest in Ceylon.
I mean, your contemporaries at Chicago were obviously some very distinguished Indologists. Was McKim Marriott there?
Yes, Kim Marriott was there. Ed Cohn.
Yes, Barney Cohn.
Barney Cohn.
Ron Inden, was he there?
Ron Inden was a graduate student and then stayed on there, yes.
And of course other great figures like Marshall Salins.
Oh, of course. Marshall Salins came after me.
Did he?
Yes.
Do you know him at all?
I don't know him personally terribly well, no. I know his work, but I had left Chicago by then.
So why did you leave? You were headhunted again, were you?
Yes. I didn't like the life in the Midwest. I am a person who likes living by the sea. And the lake, the Great Michigan Lake, was not very appealing. And I found Dennis McSmith came to visit me in Chicago because at the time he'd been working on the Sicilian mafia, and he thought he should take a look at the mafia around Chicago. And he took one look at the surroundings of the city, and at that time there was a great deal of violence still. It is still rather violent. There are still serious social problems in Chicago. And he said, life here is just grim, too grim for words. And I can see what he means, you know, after Cambridge, England. Chicago, Illinois is an uphill struggle because of the sense of alienation of large sections of the population. And so I thought, by that time I had a young family. And when Harvard came along to invite me to join them, I thought it would probably be more attractive living in Boston, and it has turned out to be so. Boston and Cambridge are very attractive places, and we have enjoyed living there. And I have brought up my 3 younger children in Boston.
Well, I'm hoping this is the first of many interviews I'll have with you, because there are so many other things to talk about. Is there any sort of particular last thing that you would like to say to the camera?
I think the problem of rationality and irrationality is really the key to a lot of our work. And I am very interested in this whole matter of the rational aspects of our consciousness, the structured, organized aspects of our consciousness, as opposed to those dark forces that Freud wrote about. And I think that we still are struggling with those matters. There is the whole area of politics, of course, but the issue of the nature of the conscience collective, the inner structuring of the conscience collective, I think, remains a challenge for us for the future.